Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ISAP thematic track on climate security titled Progress and Challenges of the Asia Pacific Climate Security Project, How to Address Diverse Risks. I'm Dr. Naoki Okano, Program Officer at the UNUIAS, and I'll be moderating today's session. I am also being a coordinator of this research project on the Asia Pacific climate security. Before we proceed, please allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. This session is scheduled to run for 90 minutes, concluding at 4:30 Japan time. And simultaneous translation is available, so please select your preferred language, English or Japanese, from the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll find somewhere here. And question and answers. We encourage you to submit questions to our speakers at any time during the session. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit your written questions. I will review your questions and integrate them into a moderated discussion segment from 4-5 onward planned. Please accept our apologies in advance if we are unable to address every question due to time constraints. Now let's begin the session. Our first task is to set the stage with a framing presentation for today's topic. So I'll be now the first speaker here. I'm going to deliver my presentation titled Taking Stock of IGES Research Project, Asia Pacific Climate Security. I shared screen. I hope it's a full screen mode. Okay. Thanks. So again, welcome to this session. In this first presentation, I'd like to discuss a general introduction to our distinguished panelists, introducing our research project on Asia Pacific climate security. So at IGES, we have been promoting this Asia Pacific climate security project since 2023, and this year is the final year of this project. And this ISAP thematic session is located in the midterm of this final year to present an early result to the domestic and international audience, and to show what's upcoming in the remaining of the year, and most importantly, what are the critical relevance of climate security debates in a changing geopolitical condition in the current global era. My talk will be very short, and I'd like to give maximum time to our distinguished speakers who are dealing with thematic topics. But I'd like to discuss very briefly what are the climate security and what is the importance to discuss it. So our starting point for this project is that climate change is no longer a simple environmental or energy concern as usually discussed in the policy arena, but it's a problem that drastically destabilizes our social, economic, and political life through various pathways. There's a couple examples here. For example, there's a social incoherence caused by internal or cross-border migration. Because of the various pressures of climate change impacts, the most vulnerable people are people suffering economically or socially due to climate impacts might mobilize from one place to the other. If such migration is coordinated by the government, it's right, but climate change might cause a very large-scale mobilization of people that might cause internal or sometimes cross-border conflicts or social incoherence. And that kind of issue is not properly addressed in the current scheme of climate policy. The other example can be resource competition over limited resources. Climate change will impact our prospect of food security or water security. Some countries feeling the water shortage, for example, in South Asia, are trying to get these water resources, and that would affect the water access in the neighboring countries. And this kind of policy in one country might affect the other country, should be also coordinated in some way or other. Lastly, there is a growing political disagreements over whether to promote climate policies, such as renewable energies. As we can see in different political scales, from domestic political discussions to the international discussion, as we see the general debates at the United Nations General Assembly, there are varying opinions to whether to promote climate action and what kind of climate actions are appropriate to implement globally. So those different issues that climate change really destabilize social, economic, and political life needs to be addressed in one way or other. And we propose that climate security provides a useful lens to investigate such issue and reflect and improve climate policy and action. At least five uh, things that commonly discussed among the umbrella of climate security, but it's not limited to that. For example, climate security or security lens help us to consider the impacts of climate change and climate action holistically. Also, it helps to identify critical pathways that climate change and climate action lead to instability. Or we can reflect on what types of security concerns, like human security or economic security, or maybe ecological security, that climate action and policy should serve. Security lens will also help us to consider and take into account geopolitical conditions for climate action and policy. And last but not least, with those considerations, it provides a space to strategize climate change action and policy at various scales. So these are the relevance, very broadly taken, of the climate change and climate security debates. Asia Pacific Climate Security Project has been taking place to investigate those issues, and it has three core objectives. One is to conduct original research and make inputs to the relevant Japanese policy. And the second is to contribute to the climate security in the Asia Pacific region through research and other kinds of activities. And lastly, given that this kind of research is still limited in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, IGES can be one of the research hubs of this field in the region. We picked up 5 thematic focuses: energy security, food security, human mobility, adaptation, and ocean governance. And I invited 5 speakers who are leading the work of each these thematic topic, so that what kind of concrete research and policy recommendations are coming out from thematic investigation. Lastly, I'd like to briefly discuss what are the timeline and upcoming things for our project. Our project launched in 2023, and we have been working and researching and doing networking with international scholars in this field in 2023 and 4. And this ISAP session is happening this October time in 2025. And in the remaining time of the year, from November to December, we plan to publish our outputs, which is the policy reports that covers those thematic topics and high-level statement about climate security and what kind of policy are needed in Japan and Asia Pacific region. And to disseminate such outputs and further interact with international audiences, we plan the final symposium on January 21st and 2nd. For those upcoming things, please subscribe to the IGES newsletter and other IGES outreach outlet so that you can keep updated with those remaining activities of our project. Okay, so that's pretty much from my end. And without further ado, I'd like to invite first presenter, who is Nando-san. So Nando-san, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Okano-san. Let me share my screen and begin the presentation. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, but it's not full screen yet. Yeah, it's full screen now.
Okay. Thank you, Okano-san, once again for the introduction, and thanks a lot to the entire team for working on this collaborative project. Now, I would like to share some observations and findings from the subtheme 1, which is focusing on energy security and how it actually interfaces with climate security issues. Now, in terms of the agenda, in the next few minutes, I'll be talking about energy and climate security, key dynamics, securitization of climate change impacts, energy transition and security, differences in climate impacts in different regions, and disparity in the capacity of different countries in addressing these challenges, and possibly what role Japan can play in developing a regional mechanism to address these challenges, and then I'll move to conclusion. Before beginning, I would like to highlight the initial objectives when we started this project. When this project was started almost 3 years back, we actually had a broad set of objectives. One is to find out, provide perspectives on climate security risks at various levels that could basically have sort of implications on decarbonization. And secondly, we also try to find out how these actually implications could be there for Japan and what kind of challenges Japan could face, as well as options, and to make recommendations for Japan's foreign policy, basically focusing at the regional collaboration as well as global initiatives. So we had a broad set of objectives when we began. Now, as we actually spent over 2 years now, we have identified some of the key issues and dynamics that are important in the climate security debate, especially when it comes to energy. First point we try to examine is that to what extent climate security is defined adequately and how it is linked with national security challenges, especially in terms of energy security. So there is an inalienable link between climate change and national security. It is definitely well discussed and well proven issue, but we actually wanted to find out to what extent this impacts energy. So that is actually one of our main outcomes of this research. Second element we actually worked is to what extent climate security is presenting challenges to energy transition, not only for Japan, but also for other Asian countries. Third element we are looking at is that to what extent climate security challenges manifest differently across different countries in the region, and how that is also exposing disparities of capacity of these countries to respond to these challenges. So the first point which I mentioned here is that to what extent climate change is linked to security concerns. And in order to understand that, we have conducted a survey of literature, talked to different people, several interviews were conducted, and we actually have our research which is progressing on this aspect, where we have identified what are the key areas of implications and how it is linked to the security paradigm. Now, one of the biggest important elements we noticed here is that when we talk about climate security or climate change impacts on national security, what kind of policies and responses are required from countries? To what extent countries must look at this as a security issue. And if countries start looking at it as a security issue, what could be the outcomes and policies? Will that lead to narrow policy responses, or will that lead to efficient policy outcomes? Will it help in addressing climate challenges in an urgent manner, or will it only lead to policies that may not be well adjusted to the actual needs? Will it lead to judicial activism? So various aspects we have looked at. So the first outcome of this research is basically mapping this climate and security linkage, and then trying to identify to what extent countries can utilize the aspects of securitization in addressing climate mitigation or climate challenges. The second element, which we consider as the most important element of our research, is that climate impacts have a broader set of implications. Climate change has broader set of implications. And one of the biggest challenges is that it can significantly affect energy transition and even net zero goals if adequate policies are not designed. The figure which you see in this slide talks about climate impacts on Japan. And especially in terms of Japan, climate impacts can affect Japan's need to access energy and resources from overseas destinations. It can affect energy infrastructure, especially clean energy infrastructure, primarily due to the extreme weather events. And there can also be implications on Japan's non-energy trade, especially when importing countries are designing policies or trade restrictions based on their climate concerns. So one of the biggest challenges which we have observed is that climate implications have a very clear linkage with energy transition and net zero goals. The third element, which we included in our study, and we are trying to find out the best ways to address that, is the fact that climate impacts affect countries differently. Certainly, that is a well-known fact. And it is also important for us to understand that all countries do not have the same capacity to address these issues. First of all, climate security implications are different in different countries. The way it manifests are different, and the way it affects the sectors which are actually suffering in these countries are different. And the countries which are facing these challenges are also having a disparity in capacity to address these challenges. For example, advanced economies may be having stronger infrastructure and capacity in terms of R&D capabilities or resources, financial resources. They must be better placed, while middle income countries are still facing the dual challenges of maintaining economic growth and energy transition. In terms of vulnerable nations, lack of financial and technology prowess, and many of them are also facing existential threat because of climate impacts. So these disparities will have to be taken into account by countries as well as the region as we move forward. Now, as part of the study, we are also trying to look at what could Japan do to address climate security challenges within Japan, or Japan faces within its borders as well as from outside, and to what way Japan can empower countries in the region to address climate security concerns. There must be local policies, adequate local and national policies, as well as regional and global policies must be there in place. Now, we believe that Japan will have a major role in addressing these, possibly developing a regional governance mechanism to address climate security concerns, probably by also aligning with some of the well-known international platforms, including United Nations Climate Security Mechanism, and also by encouraging businesses and industry to consider climate security aspects in their approaches and policies. That means taking a wider set of stakeholders in addressing these issues, because these issues cannot be actually addressed in silos. It cannot be addressed by a single party or a few parties. There need to be a bigger set of stakeholders will have to be involved. And the third element is that Japan must also try to take a leadership in mainstreaming climate security debates, in policy formulation, as well as in its track to diplomacy and interaction with other countries. Until recently, climate security concerns have been discussed in a fragmented way, and mostly it is prevalent only in the academic literature. There have been discussions of climate security probably 2 decades back. It was well developed, but you could actually see there was a fall in the debate in the past several years. So Japan will have to have a role in taking leadership in mainstreaming climate security debates. In concluding the presentation, I would like to highlight these points once again, that securitization of climate implications is important. However, considering its negative and positive aspects, countries may need to resort to a balanced approach where securitization may be of use to some extent, but at the same time, countries may have to be mindful about how to avoid its negative implications. Second, and most important, is that climate implications will play a significant role or significantly affect energy transition if adequate policies are not designed. A third element, considering that countries are facing disparities in the risk and the capacities, there is an urgent need for a regional mechanism to collectively address these challenges. The last point I wanted to highlight is that Japan's role. Japan could possibly take a leadership role and help shape a regional architecture to address these challenges. With this, I'll end my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nando-san, for the wonderful talk. Your presentation really outlined what I said in the beginning, which is how the climate security is posing a different challenge to the existing mitigation adaptation policies, and how energy transition in your case looks very different from a security lens, and what are the remaining challenges that policymakers are still not quite aware enough, but we have to really address. Right, thank you. And I'd like to turn to the next presenter, but before that, I'd like to again encourage to the audience that there is a Q&A box, and in a moderated discussion after this, we'll pick up selected questions as appropriate for to engage with the audience further. So please pose questions in the Q&A anytime. So I'd like to invite the second speaker, who is Fukuda Miki-san, Chief Policy Researcher and Lens Facilitator of the Integrated Sustainability Center, IGES. So Fukuda-san, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm sharing the screen, and hopefully everybody can see the first screen mode. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for confirmation. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the sub-theme 2, who focus on the issue of the climate-induced mobility, I'd like to share some lessons learned from national and regional responsible. So the climate mobility and security implication. Actually, the climate mobility we use here is rather a umbrella concept for the diverse movement of the human movement within this climate field. Actually, there are a variety of the people's movement caused by the climate change. For example, the displacement, migration, and planned relocation, and also the choice of immobility or staying in place that can be also become part of this climate mobility umbrella. Traditionally, uncoordinated human displacement issue was considered to raise the security concerns for both individuals and communities, underlined by the UN Secretary General's report, for example, in 2009. However, the current focus on this issue has been getting broader and broader. So now it actually addresses the threat to the social structure, cultural identity, and also the economic potential. One of the example is the Pacific Regional Framework on the Climate Mobility, developed and adopted by the Pacific Island Forums in 2023. Some of you might heard of the word climate refugees. It is actually a sensational word and it gets popularity among the world. However, it is actually not a legally recognized word under the Convention of the Refugee in 1951. So that there was actually a example in New Zealand that one Kiribati person from the Ioane Teotioka actually claimed to stay longer in New Zealand, claiming for the refugee status, but it was actually rejected by the New Zealand High Court in 2013. However, actually we are witnessing the major step in this fora. This year in July, we had seen the remarkable advancement in terms of the ICJ International Court of Justice advisory opinion over the climate change issues. And it actually confirmed the non-refoulement principle that actually acknowledged that people cannot be forced to return to dangerous places. For example, if the country of origin are considered to be the danger to live, the person are not necessarily forced to go back. This movement was actually led by Vanuatu, and also on the ground support, the initiative was supported and actually initiated by the students in the Pacific Island, namely the University of the Southern Pacific. So those people actually moved forward to make this remarkable decision, and we are seeing this, changing to address this legal gap for this climate refugee issues. So as I said, the status not legally binding yet, but we are witnessing a significant shift. And in this background, actually the IGES research team on this something too on the human mobility, here are the purpose and also the quick questions we addressed. So the purpose probably in line with the Nando's presentation just we had before. So we aim to provide a policy recommendation for a better preparedness through national and bilateral and regional approaches, mainly for Japan and other partner country in this field and the region. So that we set two key questions to address this big picture. What is a current shape of the multi-level governance? And also, what are the national and the regional policy experiences? And throughout this 3-year journey research, we have selected several countries. For example, the origin country means that the country or community that sends the people to the other part due to the climate change. For example, the Fiji, Tuvalu, Bangladesh, and Thailand. And also, as per the last final stage of our research, we also added 2 countries as a recipient country, Australia and New Zealand. Today's presentation, due to the limitedness of the time, so that I'd like to focus on the 3 countries' experiences, namely Fiji, Australia, and New Zealand. And we conducted actually a mixed method. So we also conducted this review and key stakeholder interviews and some country involved the community surveys. We visited communities in collaboration with a local partner, and then we get a chance to talk and then see and observe what happened. Somehow already experienced the relocation process. So let me start from the case study in Fiji. So this is a photo that I and my research team been to Fiji and then take there. So this is a village called Bunidogolola in Vanuatu. This is actually the second largest island in Fiji, and this is one of the first Fijian villages to experience a relocation due to the climate change. So this is used to be a coastal area village, but due to this climate change effect, they have to move up to the upper land, and they started the new village life. And we have the privilege to visit on site. Fiji actually advanced in many ways, but one of the policy framework we can mention here is that the Climate Change Act in 2021 that mandates the guideline for such plantation be sensed in the Penumbra. And that kind of successful relocation actually requires a holistic approach. For example, the economic stability is pretty much necessary for the successful relocation process. The villagers need to have a sustainable livelihood and also the market access in the new location. And another important factor we witnessed was that the culture retention. Even though they move to the new place, new destination, they need a support of the traditional lifestyle to maintain and also the community components, namely church or communal space so that the people can gather and they keep and they maintain their culture heritage. So carefully planned relocation is pretty much important process, but it actually requires appropriate follow-up process. It was a privilege that we encountered with the very first stage of the relocated village in Fiji so that we could see like a time span differences. And a follow-up and appropriate support but necessary is pretty much important for this relocation processes. Another case study is the Australia case. So this is actually a photo from the Prime Minister of the Australia shaking the hands with the Tuvaluan head of delegation. Recently, Australia started several schemes to allow the visa mobility scheme to welcome the Pacific people. Those engagement is driven by both responsibility and a strategic security interest in order to maintain Australia's regional influence. One good example and one most recent example is that the Pariperi Union, namely with the Tuvalu country. Pariperi actually means that the neighborhood or care in the Tuvalu language, and that offers migration pathway and security cooperation in the light of the climate change. This year, 2025, was the very first year to open the ballot, and actually for the 280 visas, there were 8,750 ballot registrants. So actually, it is allowed 80% of the whole Tuvalu population that I heard. And this key goal is that, of course, in terms of security interests of the both country, but at the same time to support the human mobility with dignity for Tuvaluan people. And it tried to safeguard their future identity and culture so that that is not only for the path making the pathway, but rather that has the combined approach to support their life after they arrive to Australia. Of course, we cannot judge because it just started right now, but it is pretty much insightful to see how those Australia try to welcome climate-related mobility, such Subaru country as done to agree. Another visa scheme is available for the other Pacific country, for example, Pacific Engagement Visa too. That is actually more related to the Pacific migrants who feel the labors in labor shortage in Australia, but also that is de facto helping the adaptation of the home country by sending the remittance for the home country, the migrants are. And another unique perspective we can learn from our region is New Zealand. Actually, Australia and New Zealand are slightly different approach they're taking. And actually, New Zealand started the project or this initiative to grant a visa to Pacific people much way earlier stage in back in 1990s. So already to Fiji, Kiribati, Tonga, Tuvalu people, 650 annual permanent resident visa are given. So there are already existing Pacific communities, namely in Auckland, there are almost 60% of the Pacific people living there. So that actually is serving as a hub and a safety net because already the second and third generations are living there. So it actually helps to maintain the culture heritage and support the social capital for a new coming person from Pacific country. Although this initiative is seen as a humanitarian approach, but there is a strict requirements for the people. For example, the age, the applicant need to be under 45 and there need to be the job offer with some sufficient money to go through the process so that it is actually criticized for excluding the most vulnerable. Of course, this Pacific Access category started way back in 1990, so that it doesn't really have the climate implication like Australia, but it is actually de facto used as one of the climate, mobilizing the climate mobility so that it could be kind of upgraded in due course. New Zealand tried to make a humanitarian visa experimentally in 2017, but now the discussion is actually stopped so that further discussion might be awaited and rather the approach is changed to the adaptation aid to help the home country. And Japan's role and perspective already Nandu clarified, but probably from the perspective of this climate-induced mobility team, we might want to touch upon several. For example, Japan has of course, like a criticism or like a kind of worriness to prepare for the climate migrant in the future, but not likely happening pretty much in the short term. So that the future arrivals will be driven by a combination by climate, economic, and educational pulse. And the current policies often focus on like a short term and post-disaster relief in our partner countries, but we may need anticipatory adaptation for both in mobility and involuntary displacement. And also we can start to think about the developing domestic acceptance policy that ensure human dignity, cultural respect, and not limited to the economic prosperity. And then we can align ODA and also the development policy with the aligning country like Australia and New Zealand. Lastly, key finding and conclusion. So mobility, of course, it can be caused by the climate change, but we cannot 100% sure that it is climate-only mobility. It involves economic and education aspirations. And so that we may need a human-centered approach, like a culture, identity, social structure, justice is pretty much needed to respect. Anticipatory policy, the focus must be shift from the short-term disaster relief to anticipatory adaptation for the human security perspective. And Asia, including Japan, may need higher policy attention, and we could learn from the early Pacific land relocation experiences. And we could develop the holistic policies, comparing the mobility acceptance and adaptation support to the country of origin in partnership with the other neighboring countries. So thank you very much. And it is over of my presentation. And I'd like to get the microphone back to Okana-san.
Thank you, Fukuda-san. Thank you for outlining the very diverse issues around climate mobility. As we all know, the migration is one of the most politically sensitive issues these days, and climate change impacts might intensify such political issue even further. It's one of the very challenging topic, but Fukuda-san successfully showed like different perspectives and what's really needed for policymakers to consider. Let's discuss later further. And I'd like to invite the next speaker, who is Yamabe Arisan, policy researcher at Sustainable Consumption and Production Unit, IGES. So, Arisan, floor is yours.
Thank you, Okano-san. Are you seeing my full screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction. So I am Alice Yamabe. I'm a policy researcher in sustainable consumption and production. And today I'll be presenting some of the preliminary findings and ongoing research from the subtheme 3 on food security under climate change. So here's our food security team, which is led by Kuroshima-san from IGES. And I'll begin by just framing 4 simple questions for today's presentation. So first, just an overall understanding, how does climate change affect food security? Then, can food insecurity, especially amplified by climate change, lead to conflict? And third one is the traditional definition of food security enough in an era of climate disruption? And finally, what are the implications for Japan? So here's a quick look at our methodology. So first, we conducted a literature review to understand how climate change, food security, and security issues in general intersect. And from this, we developed a conceptual framework that I will introduce, and we conducted policy analysis and field surveys in the Philippines and Pakistan to capture local realities within the regional and national policy understanding around food security. And finally, we synthesized these findings to develop policy recommendations for Japan and the Asia Pacific. So how does climate affect food security across the Asia Pacific region? So this is a little overview, very simplified. So first, high in the Himalayas, there will be glaciers melting already happening. This is happening at unprecedented rates due to global warming. And this brings flash floods that wash away the fields and communities. And over time, as those glaciers retreat, it actually brings droughts and water scarcity. And as that water flows into the coasts, there are rising seas and stronger storms that surge and that threaten Asian megacities as well as low-lying Pacific islands. And they put farmlands and entire communities at risk. And at the same time, we're seeing extreme floods inundate places like Bangladesh more and more frequently, while droughts are threatening water security and crops and livestock in South Asia and Pacific Islands. And all across the region, there's shifting rainfall and temperatures that are impacting rain-fed farming and fishing livelihoods. So what this shows is that climate change doesn't really hit food systems in a very simple or linear way. It actually creates overlapping pressures and it amplifies existing vulnerabilities and multiplies food insecurity risks, sometimes in very concentrated places, like you can see here in South Asia. And these impacts also interact with non-climatic factors such as competing water demand, rural-urban migration, as introduced by Mixin, as well as social tension, poor governance. And so let's look at one specific case here in the Philippines. So Kuroshima-san conducted surveys on the ground in Luzon, Iloilo, and Palawan Islands. So you may know that the Philippines is the world's most climate vulnerable country. And so this puts small-scale farmers and fishers at specific risks, especially with the heat, floods, and typhoons. And the survey in local communities highlighted 4 main findings. So there is a misalignment between national policies addressing climate impacts and the local realities because of lack of consultations of local communities. Also, the effects of climate change are intensifying pre-existing socioeconomic disparities within farmers and fishing communities. This is especially the case for land and irrigation rights that are deeply unequal. And in fisheries, we're observing conflicts with the commercial fleets that are intimidating small-scale fishers because some of them might be carrying arms. And we find some solutions and hope in the people's organizations. So these are local communities that when they're empowered, they can come together and help secure rights, manage shared irrigation and fishing grounds, and build capacity to adapt better for climate risks. And our second question was, what is the relationship between food insecurity, climate change, and violence? So I think a basic understanding would be that climate stress directly causes food insecurity, and that leads to conflict through resource competition, social grievances, and rising food prices. But political ecology scholars are challenging this very deterministic view, and they remind us that climate change doesn't actually hit people equally. It interacts with existing power structures. So this is why we decided to combine these approaches and try to frame the complex interactions between all the different stressors that we're seeing in a tentative conceptual framework. So here you can see that we place climate change as part of a multitude of other environmental stressors, such as biodiversity loss, pollution, and that they're compounding existing or appearing risks from local to local levels, which then lead to increased vulnerability and insecurity, as well as food insecurity. And as we were looking at this, we adopted a broader understanding of what we mean by insecurity and violence. So not just in terms of national or state security, but more in a more general human security way, as introduced by Okonasan earlier as well. So this shifts attention from only protecting borders to protecting livelihoods and human dignity. And we're also looking at further deepening our understanding of the very complex interactions between all these different stressors by currently conducting a systematic literature review on food security in the climate security literature. And this brings us to a very important question. If food insecurity is being reshaped by climate change in such complex ways, is our traditional understanding of food security still enough and reflective of the complex reality, especially the risks amplified by climate change? So you may know that food security has been traditionally defined since 1996 by the World Food Summit and FAO under four main pillars. So we have food availability. Is there enough food being produced? Food access. So is the food affordable and allocated fairly? And food stability. Is the food supplied continuously and in undisrupted ways? And finally, food utilization. Is the food safe and nutritious to consume? And we've built on recent scholarship and argued that this definition actually focuses too narrowly on food production and household access, and it overlooks the broader and deeper structures as well as the socio-ecological dynamics that shape the access to resources and decision-making powers in food systems. And to make sense of these new realities, we proposed expanding this framework to a 7-pillar model that adds sustainability. So this is about ensuring the long-term viability of socio-ecological systems to sustain food systems. Agency, which recognizes the rights, the capabilities, and decision-making power of everyone involved in the food supply chains. And resilience. So this is closely linked with climate change adaptation. It is the ability of food system to anticipate and adapt to long-term environmental transformations. So broadening this framework to the 7 pillars that I just mentioned helps us to capture the more complex societal and environmental interactions and the transformations that shape the food security. And this we hope that this will guide us more in developing more inclusive policies in this changing climate. So we applied this 7 pillars framework by reviewing the regional policies across ASEAN, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, so SARC, and the Pacific Islands Forum, so PIF. And when we reviewed all the food security related policies and frameworks from those 3 regional organizations, we realized that, yes, of course, the 4 conventional pillars appeared and were very much a focus in each of those policies. And sustainability was also recognized in most of those frameworks. But we noticed that agency and resilience, that we consider key pillars of food security, were incorporated unevenly across the regional organizations. So you can review the findings from this paper by accessing the paper through this QR code. So now, turning to Japan, let's see the implications for Japan. So you may know that Japan's food self-sufficiency rate is 38% on a calorie basis. And so this places us as one of the lowest food self-sufficiency rates among OECD countries. And this means that Japan's food security not only depends on its domestic agriculture, its capacity to produce enough food for Japan, but also on the food security of trading partners. So, as I said, we are actually mostly self-sufficient for rice, even though you may be aware that Japan has been over the past few years suffering from rice crisis. There wasn't enough rice to supply for the rice demand in the country, even though rice is supposedly the only product where Japan is self-sufficient. And vegetables is fairly self-sufficient in Japan, but we do rely on imports of key grains, so wheat, maize, soybeans. So all of these are imported from the United States and Brazil, Canada, and Australia. And from the Asia Pacific region, actually, we're not importing as many. We're not really importing any of those grains, but we do rely on the Asia Pacific region for more perishable goods, such as some frozen vegetables from China, some seafood, poultry, palm oil, tropical fruits from ASEAN. And also we note that even what is produced in Japan, so domestically, is actually heavily reliant on imported fertilizers, seeds, fuels, and also an increasingly foreign agricultural workforce, a lot of them from the Asia Pacific. So turning to the key food policy recommendations that emerged from our research. So we encourage Japan to take a people-centered approach. I'm noticing that very similar recommendations between our sub-themes. But so people-centered approach for both its import strategies and national agriculture. So this means that Japan and its trading partners need to prioritize the needs and the rights of small-scale farmers and consumers by ensuring that they're actively engaged in the policy-making processes, especially around food systems. A second recommendation is to promote sustainable, resilient, and equitable agricultural management by reforming land tenure, redesigning subsidy systems to encourage the adoption of climate-resilient crop varieties, and invest in context-appropriate climate-resilient technologies. And a final recommendation is that internationally and in the Asia-Pacific region, Japan can engage in food security diplomacy. So this is, just to strengthen the food security of Japan as well as its trade partners. And in doing so, Japan should promote a more comprehensive understanding of food security based on the 7 pillars approach. So including agency, sustainability, and resilience, and especially focusing on empowering on the agency pillars. So empowering smallholder food producers and promoting their adoption of climate resilient practices, and strengthening land and water governance by recognizing and protecting community-based rights, especially for small-scale farmers, indigenous peoples, and other vulnerable populations. So, just an overview of the 4 questions and the answers that I provided through this presentation. So the first question, how does climate change affect food security? Well, it acts as a risk multiplier, and it amplifies existing vulnerabilities in our food systems and deepens inequalities across the Asia Pacific. Second question, can food insecurity lead to conflict? Well, not directly, but it can do so indirectly through by amplifying the inequities, the power struggles, and the governance failures that are exposed by climate stresses. And the third question, is the traditional definition of food security still enough in this era of climate disruption? Well, we argue that it isn't, and we encourage the adoption of 3 additional pillars, the agency, sustainability, and resilience. And we believe that that will lead into more inclusive food system, food security policies. And finally, what does this mean for Japan? So Japan should apply this 7-pillar approach to strengthen not only its own food system, but also deepening its regional cooperation and reforming its domestic food policies and building equitable, resilient food security across the Asia Pacific. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alexandre, for presenting the work in a very comprehensive manner. I personally really enjoyed as well. And your perspective to the food security really echoes with what I said in the beginning, that how this climate security helps us to see the things differently. So the food security issue and the climate change is not simply about adapting to the changing weather pattern, but how climate change affects food access and security is really much positive and complex way. Thanks so much. Before turning to the next speaker, it's my fault, but we're running a little late. So I'd like to encourage the main speakers to really adhere to the 10 minutes limit as planned, so that we have certain time for discussion. Okay, with that, please allow me to invite next speaker, Prabhakar-san, who's a principal policy researcher, climate change unit, IGES. So Prabhakar-san, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Okano-san, and hello everybody. So I will be talking from the point of view of the sub-theme 4, wherein we try to look into how the climate security concepts and practices are reflected in the national adaptation plans, because national adaptation plans have emerged as one of the central pivots of climate action, especially from the point of view of the risk and vulnerability of the country. So it's very important that while we talk about concepts, we talk about different aspects of climate security, but unless otherwise these different dimensions of climate security are not reflected in adaptation plans, we will not be able to achieve coherent action at the national and sub-national level. I am joined by my colleagues Masashi Tsudaka and Naoko Kimura-san. So in this presentation, I will be discussing mostly in 3 ways. Excuse me, I don't know why my screen is frozen. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I have divided my presentation into 3 parts. In the first part, I will try to help you to understand how we approached reviewing the national adaptation plans, because before we review the national adaptation plans, we need to boil down or disaggregate the climate security concepts into practically identifiable elements within the national adaptation plan. So that's what we will discuss briefly. Then I will be presenting the results from the NAPs that we have reviewed, all the NAPs that have been submitted to UNFCCC so far. And thirdly, we will also be looking into how the climate security is understood by the stakeholders at the national and sub-national level through the case study that we have conducted in Sri Lanka. And finally, we will have a conclusion. So why do we need to think about the national adaptation plans at this moment? If you are following the national adaptation planning process, you will understand that currently many countries are reviewing their national adaptation plans. They have already submitted long back around 2000, between 2005 to 2015, and currently they are in the process of submitting the revised national adaptation plans. And at this stage, a lot of stakeholders are targeting the national level NAP frameworks in order to enhance the adaptation effectiveness of these particular NAPs. So this is also the right time from this particular perspective to target the national adaptation plans by looking the NAPs from the lens of the climate security and see if we need to make any changes in the NAPs that have already been submitted but will be reviewed and resubmitted in a very short time. So that is one of the incentive for us to look at the NAPs. And the other incentive is that obviously NAPs are going to be the central point of influence for policy at the national level, all matters related to climate change. So because we are talking about the climate security, we want to know how much can we make a difference by targeting the NAPs as a policy framework in order to strengthen the climate security outcomes of the NAPs. So those are the some kind of the incentives or the elements that are demanding us to target the NAPs currently. So with this particular background in question, we have broadly three research questions included in the research. One is if at all the climate change adaptation and climate security are different. First of all, we need to answer whether or not they are different or are there any additionalities or similarities between climate change adaptation and climate security. If there are additionalities of the climate security, what is that additional element that needs to be brought into the national adaptation plan so that we can enhance the climate security outcome of the NAPs? So that is one research question. Secondly, having addressed that additionality question, how do we translate those additionalities into practices, different plans or activities and things like that? What kind of plans and activities or strategies can we incorporate into NAPs to strengthen the NAPs from the climate security perspective? The third one is, as we will discuss in the next slide, as we moved from the national security paradigm to human security paradigm, there have been alienation of many stakeholders in the security related planning at the national and subnational level. So we often say those are the alienated stakeholders. So when we talk about the climate security and national adaptation plan, we definitely need to bring in these alienated stakeholders into the NAP planning process so that the NAPs can be strengthened. So these are the three broad research questions. Now, how do we understood the climate security before we approach the review of the NAPs? We have considered that initially there was a concept of the national security wherein the threats were always understood to have come from across the border. That means that some enemy is there and the enemy is going to invade us. So how do we protect us from that particular enemy? So that is one of the perspective that has demanded the national security. Over the years of development and peace and security initiatives, the cross-border threats have been gradually overtaken by the subnational security threats. And these subnational security threats have largely been combined into what is called human security. That means that more and more security concerns for the countries are coming from within the boundaries rather than across the boundaries. So that has been the paradigm shift in the security discourse over the years. So while this shift has happened, the lot of planning that has earlier taken place from the cross-border related planning emphasis has not translated or transferred to the subnational planning. So those stakeholders have largely been left out in the subnational planning, and as a result, we see that those stakeholders have largely been missing from the national adaptation plan, which are largely designed by keeping in view the national boundaries in view. Most of the NAPs doesn't consider transboundary and cross-border related threats that we will see the data that we will present subsequently. So having understood this particular paradigm change in the climate security and human security, how do we identify the elements of climate security in the national adaptation plans? So for that, what we have looked at the literature and we understood that if you focus on the human security as an outcome of various security elements, for example, food security, water security, economic security, energy security, personal security, and environmental security, that covers a large part of the human security. And once we are satisfied that a particular national adaptation plan identifies and addresses all the security dimensions, then we can say that yes, the National Adaptation Plan has satisfactorily addressed the human security aspects from the point of view of the climate change. And if it is missing some of these dimensions, then we can say that it is not completely addressing the climate security point. And for this particular purpose, we have defined climate security as the direct and indirect impacts of the climate change on various human security dimensions as shown in this particular figure. So what is the research steps? In the first step, we have reviewed all the NAPS literature. We have done some literature review as well to understand what is the broader national climate security context of different countries, while also reviewing the NAPS, because NAPS may or may not present you the complete national picture in terms of the climate security. So we need to build the complete picture of the countries in terms of the climate security before we review the NAPS. And secondly, we have done country case studies at the local level. We have used Sri Lanka and Fiji as a case study countries to understand the stakeholder perspectives of these countries. And building upon these two steps, we are moving on to understanding what are the possible policy recommendations. So in the first step, how did we review the national adaptation plans? There, in terms of the sovereign countries, there are nearly out of 197 or so sovereign countries, nearly 67 countries have submitted the NAPs to UNFCCC, and all those NAPs, excluding those which are not available in English, I think they are somewhere in the number of 5 to 7. Those NAPs were excluded, and we have included the rest of the NAPs in our review. And these NAPs were reviewed using the tools like NVivo, which reviews the document search by using the keywords, as well as based on the document keyword context identified. Then we go into individual NAPs and do rating of how each NAP is targeting what kind of security paradigm and what kind of adaptation strategies have been presented. So what are the results? So we'll be discussing about the results from now on in the next few slides. We see that obviously adaptation appears most prominently among the NAPs, but the word security appeared only 948 times among all the NAPs, and that only 36 naps. So the rest of the near about the 50% of the naps does not include any words that are related to security at all. And if you compare between LDCs and small island development states, both these groups of countries, they have a similar focus on the security coverage in terms of the number of times they refer to the word security. However, because there are more LDCs compared to seats, we happen to see more number of occurrence of the security words among the least development LDC countries.
Prabhakar-san, sorry to jump in, but
yeah, we have
please
5
try
more
to
minutes.
conclude. No, actually, time is just up, so please try to conclude in next 1 or 2 minutes, okay?
Next 1 minute, okay.
To 1 or 2 minutes, yeah. Just to show the highlight and yeah, sorry.
Okay. So if you look at the security word used in the different NAPs, Brazil, which appears to be an outlier among all the NAPs. I'm not going into the details because paucity of the time. And in terms of the different security dimensions, we see that defense and national security is least covered, followed by human security. So in terms of the different regions, how does the regions differ? We see that the climate security is largely covered by European countries, while peace and conflict is covered mostly by East Asian countries, followed by Caribbean countries. We see that migration is receiving a lot of attention among the Caribbean and East Asian countries. So if you are coming from Pacific countries or Southeast Asian countries, you may be a little bit surprised here, because we often hear about migration from these countries. And in terms of the defense, we see that West Asia countries are using more defense related focus in their NAPs. And we try to correlate some of these emphasis given in the NAPs with the actual national context using the data from these countries. For example, we try to correlate with the security threats as well as with the food security index. So subsequently, we have conducted the case studies in Fiji and Sri Lanka. And if you look at the Sri Lanka, what we did was we have done a scenario-based analysis. Step by it includes 6 steps. I'm not going to go into details. Using the community level consultation meetings in different locations in Sri Lanka, and these ones are from Fiji. Here we see that the way we assess is how much secure the communities feel about their future before and after introducing the climate scenarios. And we see that there is a large shift in the how communities feel about how confident they are about their future. That's what we are defining it as a security for the communities. So that means that there is a very less confidence among the communities about the national adaptation plans. That's the reason why there is a large shift in the way they feel about future before and after introducing the climate security. And we also did some policy level consultations, try to identify some indicators and strategies for strengthening the national adaptation plans from the climate security point of view. So those are the different, things that we have done. And in terms of the conclusion, we see that there is a large difference in the way the communities and different stakeholders understand different dimensions of the climate security and how the national adaptation plans cover those dimensions. So I end here. Probably we can discuss more later. Thank you.
Yes, really sorry to push you to conclude, but really with one of the most important issue for research that how the climate security lens will change the current existing policy of mitigation adaptation, and especially in your case, the climate change adaptation. Thanks so much. And I'd like to invite finally our last presenter, who is Dr. Akimoto Kazumine, Fellow Emeritus of Sasakawa Peace Foundation. I failed to introduce, but our research is collaborating with a couple of other institutions. One of the key collaborator and actually co-investigator is Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and Akimoto-san is from there. And for Akimoto-san's presentation, it will be in Japanese. So for international audience, I'd like to remind you again that there is a simultaneous interpretation button in the Zoom function. So please click on the English if you need to hear it in English. Okay, so Akimoto-san, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Okano-san.もう、時間が迫っておりますので、かいつまんでいきます。私の方から、海洋の気候安全保障について、短い説明をしたいと思います。海洋を舞台とします、安全保障への影響としましては、様々なものがあります。顕著なものとしましては、一つは、ここに掲げてありますように、自然災害の甚大化、それから海面上昇による生活圏への影響やその人口移動、それから海洋生態系の変化、これはその海水温の上昇によりまして、生態系がかなり大きく変化していく。それによって、その違法操業やあるいは漁業紛争というものが、発生してくるというものが危惧されます。それから、海洋自然環境の変化によりまして、その沿岸域や島嶼におけます治安、警備、あるいは防衛といった、いわゆるその伝統的な安全保障に関わるものへの、その基地機能であるとか、あるいはそれに必要な、その装備品とか武器とか、そういうものに影響が及ぶと。それから、もう一つはですね、これはアジア太平洋の方ではあまり関心が持たれないんですけれども、北極海の流氷によって北極海航路ができてくると。これによって、そのアジア太平洋の伝統的な安全保障にも大きな影響を及ぼしてくるということが考えられます。で、我々、海洋の安全保障グループでは、特にこのシーレベルライズ、海面上昇と、 それから北極海航路が及ぼす影響というものに焦点を当てた研究は今年はそのような研究をやっておりまして、本日はその中の、北極海航路が安全保障に及ぼす影響について、ご紹介したいと思います。北極海航路が開通しますことによって、例えばですね、船舶はその北極海航路を通ることによって、自由に世界の海洋を間断なく航行することができるようになります。ユーラシア大陸をぐるりと回り、またその船がそのアメリカ大陸をぐるっと回ることもできると。メビウスループのようにぐるぐると回ることができるということになります。これによってですね、経済的海運だとか経済そういうものにも影響を及ぼしますけれども、安全保障環境にも大きな影響を及ぼしていく、ことになります。これは昔の話ですけれども、日露戦争、いわゆるその日本と帝国ロシアとが、戦争を起こしたときに、ロシアの大きな艦隊はラトビアにおりまして、これが、日本海にまで進出するのにですね、約7ヶ月を要しております。で、これがですね、もし、北極海を通れたとすればですね、3分の2以下の距離で、通過することができることになります。このようにですね、北極海航路がもし開けていたとしたら、あるいは、大西洋、ヨーロッパ方面、あるいは中東の紛争というものが、アジア太平洋の紛争と密接にその相互に影響し合うというようなことが、危惧されてきます。で、これはその古典的な地政学のものですけれども、マッキンダーやスピークマンが地政学を唱えたとき、これは基本的にですね、北極海は通れないというのがその前提になって起こったものです。で、北極海がもし通れることになりますと、古典地政学というものはパラダイムシフトを起こしてしまうということになります。で、ご案内のように、日本はインド太平洋、自由で開かれたインド太平洋というものを標榜しております。そうしますとですね、前に述べました古典的な地政学で言うと、ハートランドというものは、日本が標榜する自由で開かれたインド太平洋を、想起しますと、これは、インド太平洋がハートランドということ。それと、いわゆるそれを取り囲む海洋部、その海の部ですね。これは、その、リムランドと呼ばれておりますが、この言葉を使うとすると、これまでの海洋と同じように、北極海というのはもう一つのリムランドとして生じてくると。で、アジア太平洋の安全保障というものを考えるときには、この北極海、新しいリムランドというものを考慮しなければいけないということになってまいります。で、えもしですね、仮に、その北極海というものが、安定して、平和な状態であれば、これは、その、地球全体に非常にのガバナンスとか、あるいは経済にいい影響を及ぼしますけれども、もし北極海というものが不安定な状況になっておりますと、これは、自由な、その、経済関係というものは作れなくなる。また、さらにはですね、新しい脅威というものがアジア太平洋の方になだれ込んでくるということも考えられます。それから、これがアジア太平洋の方に影響を及ぼしてきますとですね、例えば、これまでは、その、アジア太平洋の中だけでの安全保障の体制というものを作っておりましたけれども、北極海というものが航路として開ける、あるいはその軍事的に使えることができるようになりますと、アジア太平洋だけのその安全保障の枠組みでは、うまく安全保障を構築していくことができないということになってきます。それで、 各国がですね、いろいろな対応をしております。時間の関係で省かせていただきますけれども、例えばアメリカではですね、あの、お北極海でも多国間演習をしなければいけないだとか、あるいはですね、2022年にアラスカに安全保障研究センターを作ったりしておりますし、さらに、アメリカではですね、従来、と違ってですね、2024年にですね、北極戦略というものを策定している。それから皆さんご存知のようにですね、今、トランプ政権になって、グリーンランドを領有しようというような動きまで起こっております。で、同じようにですね、時間的な制約で述べられないんですけれども、中国だとか、NATO であるとか、あるいは、そのロシアもですね、様々な動きを見せております。この北極海航路が開通することによってですね、実は一番大きな、その、メリットと国益を得ることになるのは中国なんですね。例えばですね、欧州の港から、中国の上海まで、貨物船が航行するとするとですね、スエズ運河を通ると現在40日、アフリカの喜望峰を通ると50日ですけれども、これが北極海航路を通るとなるとですね、18日で通ってしまうことになります。さらにですね、北極海には豊富な LNG であるとか、あるいはその原油があると言われておりますけれども、事実ですね、現在中国の方では、アークティック LNG2 というような事業、国家的なプロジェクトを起こして、その北極海の天然ガス LNG で、中国の方に運ぶというような、プログラムを実施しております。このようなことを背景にしてですね、日本及びそのアジア太平洋諸国として安全保障環境を安定的に保つにはどうすればよいのかということで、一つにはまずは安全保障、北極海地域の安全保障環境を安定的なものにする。今、ウクライナ紛争の発生以降ですね、北極評議会にロシアは参加していっておりませんし、北極評議会では、安全保障についての議論は全く取り扱っていないというような状況ですけれども、北極海での安全保障をどのように保っていくのかという多国間の協力の枠組みが必要であろうと。もう一つはですね、北極海から今度アジア太平洋に入ってきたときにどうするのかといったときに、その、欧州方面での、安全保障上の不安定要因が、アジア太平洋にも入ってくると、そういうことを、考慮して、適切なパワーバランスを維持するためのですね、その安全保障の枠組みというものを作っていかなければいけないということになると思います。そのあたりのことを我々のチームでは、今年1年通じて、提言としてまとめようとしております。以上です。
秋元さん、秋元さんどうもありがとうございました。あの、大変、我々の研究テーマの中で、やっぱり海洋グループというのは少し違いといいますか、もう少し違う目線からその地域の秩序というものを見て、ただ、大きく気候変動で、この日本の、まさにダイレクトにナショナルな安全保障に関わるところが、変遷しているということを非常に大事な部分を扱ってくださっていると思っています。どうもありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。Okay, I switch back to English. Sorry for due to my bad time management, we have only 7 minutes left. We have a pre-prepared question for panel, but before going there, I recognize one quick question that I see in the chat box, and I'd like to invite Fukuda Miki-san to respond to that. For the English speaker, I'm not sure whether you can translate that in your end, but I can briefly summarize. So you talked about climate refugee. So, and if you invite those people coming in, and if you identify some country or other for specific country that Japan or other country can welcome people from there, then it essentially means that you're creating another nation state within your own country. So that's kind of question coming in. So what are the what are the response and what are the your question, your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Okano-san, and also thank you very much for the audience that today's discussion. I think this the federal state model in Japan might be very difficult and it's impractical. The example that I showcased today is Australia, New Zealand, and also the Pacific Islands. And these islands and also the Australia, New Zealand has a strong relationship for a long history, and they have so many communities already existing in both countries as a host society to support socially and also culturally to the newcomers. So I would say that Japan can also start gradually, if necessary, from the neighborhood country who might share like a culture or the common sense of the value. And also, what I found very interesting through my research trip recently to Australia and New Zealand was that the Pacific migrants per se is not one-way migration. They actually have the very strong sense of tie to the land and also the home country, so that I'd say that the practical approach that we can take is that not the necessary like a permanent visa, but rather like a temporary visa that allows the migration in both sides coming and back forward. And that actually the lessons we can, as a Japan, can learn from their experiences. So that's my brief answer to the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As I also said, the breeding migration is very politically sensitive issue and we need to carefully navigate it. But I think climate migration or climate mobility issue tells us that how we should be prepared for those issues because there is so much uncertainty with what's happening in terms of mobility or migration. Okay, so though time is limited, I'd like to do a quick round just with one question to reflect upon your own research and to discuss what are the future prospects. So I'd like to invite all the panelists to open your video. Great. And share the screen very quickly. These are the two questions we pre-prepared for the panel discussion, but I just limit to the second question and very quickly go through your impression one by one. So the question is, amidst a fluid geopolitical landscape, what is required for future climate security research and initiatives in the Asia-Pacific region? So you discuss what you found and what are needed for Japan. So I'd like to ask your prospect as what are the new thing or new research initiative or activities that we should do in the coming era concerning the current political situation? It's very difficult to answer within 1 minute, but just want to quickly go through to wrap up the session. So please allow me to invite Nandu-san to begin.
Thank you, Okano-san, for the question. In fact, one of the most compelling element in our research is the linkages between climate security and energy transition. Now, we actually when we discuss about climate security or energy transition, there's a tendency to discuss this in silos. And as I mentioned during my presentation, most of the discussions around climate security is happening primarily in the academic context, and you don't actually find much discussion and debates in the policy circles. I think Japan's step forward in this direction is really important. So one of the most important element is that climate security debates and discussions have to be integrated in addressing net zero transition, because most of the challenges that climate change is posing can adversely affect or probably even reverse transition, especially because the challenges it poses on renewable energy facilities, renewable energy installations, etc. So I would actually like to highlight the linkages between energy transition and climate security as most compelling, and it is extremely important for further discussions. I'll stop
Thank you. Right, thank you. So Fukuda-san, what's your view?
Okay, thank you very much. 1 minute is really hard, but well, I would say that the partnership with likely minded country to effectively like co-develop the holistic policies and also the participation is pretty much important from my perspective. It was my privilege to work together with a partner institute in this project, and obviously those people and also the person who are at the front, those voices are necessary. So that I hope that our research initiative itself can actually empower the people that can align to the Alice presentation, but hopefully our research initiative can go forward together with those people on the front. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Alice-san.
Thank you, Okana-san. This is a big challenge. So I think, I evidenced in my presentation that food security wasn't unilaterally impacted by climate change and the complexity of all the different stressors and factors. So I think we just need more data and understanding how climate change interact with not just food systems, but also the trade dependencies and the social inequalities. And we need more understanding of the local realities in the Asia Pacific region.
Thank you. Kabakawa-san, please.
Thank you, Okano-san. So basically, from our research, what we have seen is that once you disintegrate the climate security into different subcomponents and different practical elements, then things make very easy. And then you will start seeing that various elements of the climate security start appearing different in different parts of the national adaptation plans. However, we still see that there are at least two gaps in the current national adaptation plans. One is the current national adaptation plans doesn't go to the extent of the peace and security. They only look at up to water security, food security, energy security, and things like that. But they don't go into do these lack of security targeting security, does that lead to some kind of conflict at the local level? And what could be the conflict resolution mechanism? So those kind of things are still left over. The second one is the way the local stakeholders understand climate security and what the climate adaptation plans how they should target is completely different from how the NAPs have approached the climate security. And largely this is because the NAP process failed to engage a lot of local stakeholders. And that is the kind of a complaint that we have received both from Sri Lanka and Fiji and in many other consultations that we did elsewhere as well. And obviously, in any policy process, the consultations cannot be 100%. But still, we need to try to engage as many leftover stakeholders in the process as possible so that large concerns can be met. Thank you.
Thank you, Kabakawa-san. Lastly, Akimoto-san,すいません、少し時間をオーバーしてしまいました。
はい、ありがとうございます。
ちょっと今後について一言。
前回の国連の総会で気候変動というのは、デマだとありえないんだというような発言もありましたけれども、もう一度ですね、気候変動というのは実際に起こっていて、それによって、その安全保障にも、大きな影響を及ぼしているんだというのを、これをもう一度アジア太平洋諸国の中で、共通の認識に、もう一度共通の認識にすることが重要だと思います。以上です。
どうもありがとうございました。皆様改めまして、有益なインプット、それから議論に参加いただいてありがとうございました。Thank you all for joining and stimulating discussion, and thank you all for the audience. I went 2 minutes past. I'm really sorry for my bad time management, but I hope that you enjoyed this session. So before closing it, I have a little announcement. So I'd like to announce that again, it's a part of the ISAP International Conference organized by IGES, and this is thematic track number 4. And there is a session remaining, which is thematic track 5, which is titled National Implementation and Current Status of Nature-Based Solutions to Address Climate Change Issues. And my former colleagues and friends, Yamanoshita-san and Saito Sensei will be there, and you will really enjoy the session. So please consider registering it. So you can find the details and the registration link for Subtheme 5 on the ISAP 2025 website. And I think, in the chat box, there are the event details and maybe a little other information. Right, finally, before you log off, we'd like to ask you for your cooperation. When you close the Zoom window, a short survey will appear, and your feedback is crucial for IGES to improve our future events, and please take a moment to complete it. Right, that's it. So thank you for joining us, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Okano-san.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.